before we get started with today's episode, if you could please subscribe to Show Me STL, and that way you're ahead of the real estate curve. Now, if you should have questions, whether it's buying, selling, or building wealth through real estate, please drop those in the comments below. I'm happy to answer them. And without further ado, let's get started with today's episode. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Show Me STL podcast, and I'm Zach. So today's episode is different. It's educational, it's historical, and it's important. If you've ever wondered why some homes just a few minutes apart in St. Louis can have a drastically different value, why certain neighborhoods have struggled with appreciation, or why some areas seem to have had generational stability while others haven't. That didn't happen by accident. Today we're going to talk about how history shaped the St. Louis housing market, specifically redlining. The 1963 Jefferson Bank protests, urban renewal, the demolition of the Pruitt-Egout building, the Delmar Divide, and finally, the Ville, one of the most powerful historic Black neighborhoods in our city. Now, this is not political. This is simply educational. Because I believe if you're going to sell or invest or buy in St. Louis, you should know and understand the ground you're standing on. So let's start with the 1930s. During 1930s, the federal government created something called Homeowners Loan Corporation. Their goal was to stabilize the housing market during the Great Depression. Now that sounds great, right? But here's what actually happened. They created maps of cities across America, including St. Louis, and they graded neighborhoods from A to D in the image you'll see here. Neighborhoods were colored green were considered the best. Neighborhoods that were in blue were considered still desirable. Neighborhoods in yellow were considered declining, and neighborhoods that are in red were labeled hazardous. Now, here's the issue with this. If a neighborhood had Black residents in it, regardless of the income, regardless of the condition, it was automatically marked red. Banks then used those maps to decide who received loans. So if you lived in a red area, you were denied a mortgage. You were denied capital. You were denied refinancing. You were denied wealth building. And that is the definition of redlining. And this happened right here in St. Louis. Entire sections of North St. Louis was redlined. So what happens when a community is cut off from mortgage capital for decades? Homes age without reinvestment. Property values stagnate. Generational wealth does not compound. And meanwhile, in the green areas, mostly white neighborhoods, they received easier financing, lower interest rates, and had stable continued growth. This is one of the foundational reasons why we see the wealth gaps and appraisal differences today. But redlining wasn't just about the maps. People eventually fought back. So in 1963, Jefferson Bank protests, the activists, including members of the Congress of Racial Equality, began protesting Jefferson Bank in St. Louis. Why that bank? Well, because that bank would take deposits from Black residents, but would not hire Black employees and would not fairly lend into the Black community. Now, let that sit for just a moment. You can put your money in the bank, but you can't have representation that works there. You can't borrow money from that bank. That's systemic. And protesters organized sit-ins and demonstrations. It led to more than 400 people being arrested. This became one of the most significant civil rights demonstrations in St. Louis history. And again, this wasn't symbolic. This wasn't political. This was about access to capital. Because without access to capital, you cannot buy a home, you can't build a business, and you can't grow wealth. So when we talk about housing patterns today, we have to remember that for decades, access was intentionally restricted. And while protests were happening, another policy was reshaping an entire neighborhood, which would lead me to the urban renewal and the Pruitt-Igoe. So in the 1950s and 60s, the government launched what was called urban renewal, and the stated goal was modernization. But many refer to it as Black removal. One of the largest Black neighborhoods destroyed during this time was the Mill Creek Valley. Thousands of residents were displaced. Homes, businesses, churches, entire ecosystems of community erased. And in their place, this high-rise public housing was built, including the infamous Pruitt-Igoe development. Now, it was originally built with optimism, but in reality, it was underfunded, poorly maintained, and socially isolated. And by 1972, it was demolished. And when you demolish housing without stabilizing communities, you don't just remove buildings, you're resetting wealth. So if you can, imagine owning a home for 20 years and then it being taken from you due to eminent domain. All the equity is gone. Urban renewal reshaped St. Louis in ways that we still feel today. And the physical divide that remains, where it's most visible, is in the Delmar area. So Delmar Boulevard, nationally known as the Delmar Divide, north of Delmar, you have a higher percentage of Black population, lower median of household income, lower average home value. South of Delmar, higher income, higher appreciation, different school access, and different investment patterns. And again, this isn't random. It's a layered policy that's taken place over decades. Now, here's what's important for potential buyers and investors. History tells us where value was suppressed, but the markets evolve. And so then you have revitalization efforts, you have new construction, you have community reinvestment. Understanding this context helps you think long term, because appreciation isn't just about granite countertops and wood floors. It's about infrastructure, policy, and the reinvestment cycle. But before the divide, there was a neighborhood that symbolized Black excellence, and that was known as the Ville. Now, the Ville was once a cultural and intellectual heart of Black St. Louis. It was home to Sumner High School, the first Black high school west of the Mississippi, Homer G. Phillips Hospital, one of the largest Black hospitals in America at the time. You had doctors, lawyers, musicians, educators. The Ville wasn't just surviving segregation. It was thriving despite it. And this is important because it shows something powerful. When access to equal capital, excellence thrives. There are still historic homes in the Ville today. They still have the architectural character. They still preserve that legacy. And when we talk about preserving neighborhoods, this is what we're talking about. History that deserves to be respected. So now beyond the Ville, because it's not just the Ville, you had other neighborhoods like Hyde Park. You had Jeff Vanderloo. You have the Greater Ville. You have Old North St. Louis. They all carry deep historical roots. And as investors and homeowners, we have a responsibility to understand what came before us. Revitalization should not mean erasure. Growth should not mean displacement. You can build equity while honoring history. And as someone who works in this market every day, I believe understanding this context makes you a smarter buyer and a more strategic seller. So when you drive through St. Louis and when you see difference in property values, when you hear people talk about North City or South City, now you have a better understanding as to why. Redlining, the protests, urban renewal, displacement, division, and resilience, more importantly. It's very interesting that you can take a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house in the Florissant area, and that home is between 250 to 300,000. You can pick that house up and move it just 15 minutes to Maryland Heights, and it becomes a $300,000 to $400,000 property. You can move it over 10 more minutes and go into the Creve Coeur area, and it becomes a $500,000 to $650,000 home. And if you should happen to go into the Town and Country Chesterfield area, it becomes a $700,000 to $800,000, and in some cases even $900,000 home. I find that very interesting that in 30 minutes you can go from an $800,000 home to a $250,000 home while maintaining the same square footage, 2-car garage, and same bedrooms, same brick outer layer. It's just a change in distance. And as a real estate professional, it's important that you understand, I don't just sell homes. I also study the history that comes behind the land. Because being proactive, efficient, and informed, that's how you make strong real estate decisions. And in this episode, hopefully you find that I added value for you. And if I did, please feel free to share it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. And if you're looking to buy, sell, and invest in St. Louis, and you don't have an agent, let's have a conversation. This is Show Me STL Podcast, and I'm Zach, and I'll see you on the next episode.